Time for Clear for Takeoff with Rich Kaplan with some more very interesting aviation news. Take it away, Rich.
Thank you, Howie. For many, the Airbus A380 is the largest commercial jet in the skies, but is it a turkey or is it an eagle? There are two separate incidents where an A380 lost an engine while in flight. The first incident involved a Qantas Airbus A380 operating from Singapore to Sydney, Australia. The second involved an Air France A380 operating from Paris to Los Angeles, California. On Saturday, Flight 66 was forced to make an emergency landing in Canada. This was after one of the aircraft's four engines suffered an uncontained engine failure. Basically, an uncontained engine failure is that the engine exploded and the pilots can't determine why it exploded. Pictures posted by social media showed the front of the engine completely sheared away. Now, if my camera guy can zoom in, this is the front of the engine right here. The entire front was gone. Nothing left. The fans were gone, the blades shredded, everything in its path. In spite of the intense damage from the photos on the Twitter and on various social media, were likely never in any danger. The passengers were never in any danger because the aircraft is so large it limped its way back to Canada. Forgive me, I have difficulty reading my handwriting.
I know what that's like.
In an interview, Air France confirmed that one of its A380s had suffered a severe engine failure and was diverted to Goose Bay, Canada. An investigation is currently underway to shed light on this severe incident, notably with representatives from the BEA. This is France's version of the National Transportation Safety Board, or the French Aviation Accident Investigation Bureau. The aircraft's manufacturer, Airbus, and Air France. The stranded passengers were accommodated on two specifically chartered flights. Because the A380 is so large that one aircraft wouldn't do, they had to have two aircraft just to get everybody on board. Should one be worried about flying on such an aircraft? Sometimes. Instances of airlines losing an engine on obviously not intact. God, I can't read my handwriting. Not intact of. Okay, let me improvise. Basically, when an aircraft loses an engine, they rely on the other engine to limp it back. In other words, you have four engines here. The third engine, engine number 3, was the one that exploded on Qantas, and it sheared holes into the wing, which is unheard of. As an aviation expert, I even questioned how this jet made it back to Sydney, but it did. And the reason it did is because you have such a large wing that you create what's called laminar flow. Laminar flow is the lift generated that allows the aircraft to fly. Forgive me, this plane's really heavy. But basically, when the aircraft's in flight, thank you, Howie, you're generating your lift from the engines. The engine's sucking in air like a vacuum cleaner and spitting it out the rear. What happened here is that engine number 3 exploded in flight, shedding parts of the engine into the wing, and thus causing the aircraft to be unstable in flight. Fortunately, the pilots are trained in these situations on simulators to deal with such an incident, and were able to right the aircraft and limp it back to safety in Singapore. What's important is that this is not a separate incident. You have two incidents involving the same type of aircraft, but what's interesting though is that the manufacturers shed light on the fact that both airlines use different engines. The engine involved in the Qantas incident was a Rolls-Royce Trent 900, and the incident involving an Air France A380, I believe, was a Pratt & Whitney GP7200 turbofan engine. Now, both of these engines are rated at around 40,000 pounds of thrust. Now, if you can imagine 40,000 pounds pushing your body up against a wall, that's pretty much the amount of thrust these engines are generating when they're in flight. Anything that disrupts that flow disrupts the flow of air going through the aircraft, because in essence, an airplane's like a knife. If you look at a knife, they're very similar in shape. You have the front sloped downward, and you have the rear going upward, and then you have a tail and your wings. That's one of the reasons why in aviation school we talk about how airplanes slice their way through the sky. This aircraft miraculously made it back. The pilot was credited with saving close to 500 lives, and Airbus comes out smelling like roses, but the reality is, what caused that engine to explode in the first place? We still don't know. They've been investigating for the longest time, and they still have yet to determine how much damage the engine generated. They still haven't determined what caused it. One of the most common causes that I can talk about is bird strikes. We live on Long Island, and we know about all the birds around Long Beach, around Island Park, around JFK. A Canada goose brought down a B-1 bomber, which is hard to imagine, but it's the truth. A flock of Canada geese hit a B-1 bomber in Texas, brought the jet crashing into the ground, killing all on board. It's not something that I take very lightly. As an aviation expert, I have fought vehemently to get legislation to get these airports falcons to chase these birds, because pedigree falcons are the best birds in the defense of bird strikes, because they can fly at high altitudes, and in a dive they can reach speeds of close to 200 miles an hour. They don't mess around. So if it was a bird strike, we'll never really know the truth, but it seems logical because it's in pattern to what we saw with the Miracle on the Hudson jet, where both engines were totally shredded, and yet Sully was able to bring the jet for a controlled crash landing in the Hudson. So Howie, I think the moral here is when you fly, take into account where you're flying out of. Always sit close to, like, if you can, try to sit close to an exit, and listen very, very closely to what they demonstrate of the safety features of the aircraft. That is the most important thing. It will save your life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rich Kaplan.